Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saeeduddin Faridi. I'm a research analyst here, and I will be your host for today's episode, which looks at COP29 and the emerging discussions around climate finance. Climate finance has long been a contentious and complex issue. It serves as an umbrella term for funds directed towards activities, programs, and projects aimed at tackling climate change, including efforts in mitigation, adaptation, and building resilience. In recent years, climate finance has gained even greater prominence in international diplomacy, particularly through the work of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and its annual COP conferences. The 2009 Copenhagen Summit marked a significant milestone where developed countries jointly committed to jointly mobilizing $100 billion a year by 2020 to address the needs of developing countries. This was further reaffirmed in Paris in 2015. However, these developments have not materialized as planned exactly, and the path to a global consensus on climate finance remains challenging with numerous questions around the quantity of funds required, who should contribute, how to track and measure the progress, and how much of the planned funding has actually materialized. At COP29 this year, which was held in Baku, climate finance was once again at the center of the discussions. One of the key outcomes was the establishment of the new Collective Quantified Goal on Climate Finance, which aims to scale up financing efforts for the next phase of climate action. And to discuss and unpack some of these more recent developments on this, we are glad to be joined by Dr. Gautam Jain, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Gautam Jain, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Just to start this conversation, could you tell us how you view the recently concluded discussions around COP29 and what were some of the key outcomes from the conference?
Sure. Look, nobody would say that the COP29 outcome was a huge success, but I think there were some positive elements to it, a little more than what the initial negative headlines that we're seeing may make it appear to be. For example, until the last minute, it was not even clear if a deal would materialize, but we did get a deal. The final climate finance target of 300 billion is much less than what developing countries were asking, which was of the order of 500 billion or so. But it's higher than the current 100 billion number that we have. And it's higher than the 250 billion that was being floated up until a day before that. And beyond this 300 billion climate finance target, there's also the language about 1.3 trillion in finance. Essentially, the COP29 document asks all actors to work towards enabling 1.3 trillion in finance for developing countries by 2035, which encompasses this 300 billion number as well. And this total amount is supposed to come primarily from private sector. Now, this is important because the last 100 billion figure that we had was basically, an arbitrary number that was pegged. This number, the 1.3 trillion, is important because it acknowledges essentially the needs and priorities of developing countries because it's in line with what the independent high-level experts group have suggested is needed by emerging and developing economies, excluding China, in terms of climate finance. So all in all, I would say it's a mixed outcome, maybe not as negative as it appeared to be from the headlines that we saw.
I do want to come back to the negative headlines that you mentioned because we saw that there were some strong reactions from global South countries, particularly regarding the adoption of the 300 billion number. So, what are some of the concerns of countries like India and Nigeria about this new agreement?
Sure. So, like I said, when you look at the estimates from the independent high-level experts group on climate finance, which was established by the presidencies of COP26 and 27, they're estimating total needs of about 2.4 trillion per year. that emerging market and developing economies, excluding China, need per year to meet basically the climate mitigation adaptation needs that they have. Right. So of this 2.4 trillion, what they suggest is roughly 1 trillion should come from external sources. And of this 1 trillion, roughly half, which is about 500 billion, should come from public sources, driven by or led by developed countries. So when you look at that figure and you look at the 300 billion, obviously it's less than what should have come out or what was expected by developing countries. So there is some room for disappointment. But like I said earlier, I think putting it in context of everything that we have, it should not be as dire or should not seem as dire as it seems. Don't forget that developed countries also have fiscal issues following the pandemic. And then another issue is there's a change in leadership in the US following the election. So for some countries on the spectrum of the advanced economies, for them to agree to a sort of a greater number would be problematic because they do not know exactly where the US stands on this, so they do not want to be left holding the bag. And from the perspective of developing countries also, given the unpredictability of President-elect Trump, it probably made sense for them to accept this figure, which is, like I said before, it's higher than the current number by 3 times. So all in all, again, there is room for disappointment. There is reason for disappointment for these countries, but I think it was, to me, a pretty reasonable outcome.
Yeah, I do want to pick up on the point on the return of Donald Trump, and we'll come back to that later in our discussion. But just to understand the financing aspect here, how have things changed from before in the sense that the agreements have largely been non-binding, and the Paris Agreement uses the kind of language that developed countries shall contribute and so on and so forth. So has there been any development on that front in the New Deal?
No, and I think it's also very difficult to make that happen. I know, from the perspective of developing countries, they would look for specific, clear guidance on exactly, who's doing what, right? So for that, anything that's sort of binding makes a lot more sense. So, for example, not just the total amount, but also, what falls within this total amount, like how much should go towards adaptation, for example, how much of it is grants and deeply concessional loans and so on. Obviously, they would like it to be more transparent, and basically they would like there to be more clarity on those figures. But it's obviously difficult to do so. I mean, to the extent that they could have given some indications, for example, they did before, like doubling the amount for adaptation or something like that, would have been helpful, but was not agreed to in this text.
So I do want to talk about the climate finance landscape, so to say, and it's a fairly complicated system with a lot of stakeholders and actors involved. So to sort of make sense of the numbers, can you shed some light on how critical the numbers at the 300 billion number discussed at COP29 is, and perhaps how does it change the composition of climate finance? Is it if you look at climate finance as a pie, where does it shift and where is financing moving in that sense?
So going back to the total estimate of $1 trillion, roughly half of that, like I said, should come from public sources, which is essentially, multilateral and bilateral climate financing that, from developed to developing countries. So they include a significant portion of what the multilateral development banks do, right? So if you look at multilateral development banks, they have in recent years increased the amount that they devote towards climate finance. The latest figures that they have is something like they would contribute something of the order of 120 billion towards climate finance, and further mobilize something like 65 billion from private sources. So almost, I would say 60% of this 300 billion seems to be coming from multilateral sources. The remaining should be bilateral sources. So that is kind of how the current 300 billion is composed of. If you look at the estimates that the experts group has, if you look at the breakdown, it is, it falls quite, nicely in that area. The other aspect that we haven't talked about is, who the contributors are, right? So there was also, in addition to the quantity of climate finance, that was also a very important and controversial topic of discussion. Some of the developed countries, for example, were insisting that countries such as China, Gulf states that have become wealthy and have a pretty large carbon emission footprint should also contribute. And that was another portion that was discussed quite a bit. In the end, the way these agreements is that there are certain countries that are, that are basically obliged to contribute, which are developed countries. So these are what are called the Annex 2 countries, there are 23 of them. And then there is the G77 group, which is actually 134 countries of developing, basically consisting of developing nations, and China is obviously one of them. So there was a lot of discussion on that. Ultimately, the language was tweaked a little bit in the sense that in the past, these are countries that are encouraged to contribute as opposed to obliged for the other 23. And the language changed a little bit in the sense that in the past it said they are encouraged to voluntarily provide support. This time around, it says they're encouraged to voluntarily make contributions. So again, nothing is binding, nothing is set in stone, but at the same time, it's moving the needle in the right direction.
Right. And I think the question on who the contributors are eventually to financing these things and the entire fracture between the developing and developed countries has been very critical to the entire discourse on climate finance. And in this sense, sort of the American case is quite interesting because over the years you see American climate policies and it kind of appears as a reluctant power in global climate initiatives, regardless of which administration might be in power, and it's actively sort of ensured financing and mitigation measures remain voluntary and rather than enforceable, and policies like the IRA then create their own complexities for countries, even American allies, in their own transition journeys. So do you think the US sees itself as a responsible environmental power?
So, there's no doubt that if there was consistency by the US when it comes to climate policy, it would be much more beneficial for the rest of the world and it would have a much greater impact. However, like any other country, the approach taken by the US is pretty much defined by its own domestic politics, right? So, for example, one of the issues that the politicians have grappled with is the issue of carbon price. So the country still does not have a carbon price at the federal level. It's difficult to pass a bill that imposes a price on carbon emissions. So in lieu of that, or because that cannot happen, it turned out to be better or a more acceptable approach, which is what the Biden administration took in terms of approving the Inflation Reduction Act or IRA, which effectively, in a way, the way it works is industrial policy that subsidizes clean energy investments. Obviously, this approach can create tensions with other countries because it's promoting these developments and investments within the US and it's subsidizing it. So as a result, you can see why some of the other countries would not see it as the best outcome. Having said that, this is an approach that also supports decarbonization, which benefits all the countries. This is an approach that can lead to development and potential commercialization of new technologies, which would again benefit all countries. So I think all in all, it is kind of the pragmatic approach that was taken, and it's not something that every country should or would prefer. but this is a path towards decarbonization that the US is taking. Now, there are other things that will change, with the change in administration. President Biden launched the first US international climate finance plan in 2021, which contributed, something like 11 billion last year, which is much higher than where it started, which was of the order of a billion in 2021. So it's obviously, again, not a very large number in the context of what's needed, but it's a significant increase from where it started. Similarly, DFC, which is the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, has been much more active in climate investments. Same thing, the Biden administration has pushed World Bank and other multilateral development banks to do more towards climate finance, contribute more towards it. That's why we have, partly because of that, we've been seeing an increase in their contributions as well. Now, of course, with a change in the administration, some of these things may change potentially. Just like last time, President-elect Trump may decide to exit from the Paris Agreement, which would obviously create a little bit of a mess on the global stage. US will not necessarily be at the table in terms of climate negotiations, so it'll be a little bit messy, but we've been there before. Let's see how far it goes this time, in the sense that there is a risk that in addition to exiting or withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, President Trump may opt to also exit from UNFCCC, which would be a little bit of a sort of a harder or a more difficult step to undo, which is, last time President Biden re-entered Paris Agreement, but if you exit UNFCCC, it may need a two-third majority from the Senate to go back in. So it may create some complication, but I do think that a lot of investments are happening nevertheless around the world, especially in China and Europe, but also in India and many other countries. And I don't see that aspect changing. Even in the US, the market dynamics are quite important. So if you look at investments in renewable energy and clean energy systems, all in all, they have been growing, right? So if you look at the first term of President Trump, he had talked about bringing back coal and pushing back against renewable energy investments. But if you look at actually what happened, there are many coal power plants that entered bankruptcies, and investments in renewable energy continued. So the market dynamics are quite important. And from the perspective of President Trump, he has also, at least during his campaign, talked about repealing the IRA. But the IRA is benefiting many districts, or primarily, something like 3/4 to 80% of the investments are happening in districts that were won or are being led by Republicans. So it'll be not so easy for him to repeal, at least in its entirety. Maybe it can be tweaked a little bit. So again, similar to what we saw, as a COP29 outcome, this is not a ideal or perfect outcome. It may change the trajectory a little bit in terms of the slope or the pace of investments in clean energy systems, in the sense that it may be a little slower than what we would like, but I still think it'll grow over the next 4 years as well.
So that's actually a very interesting point, and I did sort of was curious about that myself because when we look at the growth stories of like emerging countries, we're looking at China, India, Indonesia, they're all making huge investments in green technologies and trying to develop their markets to that level. And when you see rhetoric from Trump, you do sort of hear how he's against these things, uh, but you do see that because the market finds favor in these technologies now, and they've become very commercialized, and so that's since that is the future. It's interesting to hear that while the rhetoric might exist in some direction, the economics has taken its root as well. But and you also addressed some of the questions on how Trump's re-election might see the US exiting COP and UNFCCC. But I do want to probe a little bit more on that because during Biden's tenure, we saw how climate action had become a very critical element of foreign policy. And in most agreements, in most economic and trade agreements, climate featured quite significantly. Even in their cooperation with India, the Quad, climate features as an important element there. Do you see that changing with President Trump coming in next year?
So again, anything that you would say or use the term climate or anything related to climate change specifically, obviously this is not something that we in favor of. But ultimately, if you think about what's happening is as a result or sort of to address this climate crisis, there are a lot of investments that are happening in energy. So it's basically think of it in terms of energy security, think in terms of energy affordability, reliability, and not necessarily in terms of it's the need for us to address climate change. So if you sort of reframe the issues in those terms, then I think for anybody who's looking at the U.S. as a leader in terms of infrastructure investments, in terms of investments in new technologies, obviously this is a place where you would want to be. So as the president, if you speak to him about infrastructure, he would be interested in that, right? So similarly, he would be interested in encouraging more technologies to come up, right? So if you reframe the issue in those terms, I would not think there'll be much of a difference in the approach. I think it's a little bit of a framing issue, and you can see many efforts that the U.S. may make in different parts of the world. For example, investments, let's say in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in India, and other places. I do not see those being impacted because ultimately U.S. would like to see itself as a leader in this space. Again, to the extent that U.S., let's say, exits from the Paris Agreement, it's not yet clear whether U.S. will withdraw from UNFCCC, but if it does, obviously the risk is then basically it's ceding the ground to China to become the leader, which in effect, given the amount of investments that happen in China in clean energy, it may already be sort of vying for that space anyway. So again, thinking in those terms, then maybe the White House under President Trump may rethink if they want to give up the leadership in this space, and therefore that could be one factor that dissuades them from exiting completely from the UNFCCC. So let's see what happens. I do think that there are certain elements of this that are quite important to President Trump, both what he said in his campaign and what you can judge from his own business credentials that he likes to talk about. So from those perspectives, I would think if we reframe the issues as more related to investments in energy infrastructure, related to energy security, reliability, affordability, I don't see why he would not agree in terms of pushing for those as well.
Great. I think there's a lot to look out for on that end. But thank you so much, Dr. Jain, for joining us for today's episode and for all your insightful answers. Our listeners will greatly benefit from this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work on our website, isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also find regular updates on our publications through Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.